Again, good morning and welcome back to Momentum. And I think we can still say Happy New Year, right? It's still kind of early in the new year. Last week we began our study in the book of Philippians. And if you've been reading it, I hope you've been enjoying it. But we started it and we found that Paul was providing an example, really, of what it looks like to have true partnership, real fellowship in following Jesus together. This was the overarching theme of the letter that we've been agreeing to. And we saw how one dimension of loving one another and being the family of God together was perseverance. To love one another means that we are together and doing God's will kind of over time. And that means putting up with each other's faults and forgiving one another, supporting one another through twists and the turns of life. Paul and the Philippians had this decades-long, really, relationship of mutual love and support. And they overcame obstacles of time and distance and resources, prison, right? Paul's in prison and persecution. They really put the work into their relationship with one another. We, on the other hand, right, in our day and age, we friend one another and unfriend one another just with a click of the mouse. And to be honest, church hopping and church shopping from one church to another, really more of the norm, rather than settling down and really putting the work in and being part of one congregation for a long period of time. How do we have that kind of longevity? Perseverance with one another, resilience in our lives so that we can continue to walk alongside others, loving people for the long haul. And if you like him, or if you don't like him, if you think he's the biggest cheater in the world or the best quarterback ever to ever have been, you cannot deny that the person who knows probably the most about longevity, especially in the sports world, resilience, is Tom Brady. Tom Brady, right? 44 years old. He is the oldest active player in the NFL. And of course, he's not like this other guy, Adam Vinatieri. He's like retired last year, 42 years old. He's not like some kicker who comes out onto the field like 2 or 3 times every game, or a bench warmer. No, Tom Brady plays week in, week out, season after season after season, snap after snap after snap. What is Tom Brady's secret to get him to be an NFL 44-year-old? Well, the internet tells us. Tom Brady wakes up every day at 6 o'clock. He begins his morning by drinking 20 ounces of water with electrolytes. He probably sprinkles something in there, right? After that, he showers. He drinks a breakfast smoothie that is nutrient dense. He's got high in fat, high in protein, high in calories. Lunch, often a piece of fish, but always with lots of vegetables. And dinner is similar. He says, another nutrient-dense meal that includes lots of vegetables. So, if you're younger, eat your vegetables, you'll be just like Tom Brady, right? That's what Tom Brady eats. What does he not eat? No white sugar. No white flour. No MSG. It's the triumvirate of everything that I like, right? No white sugar, no white flour, no MSG. And no what he calls nightshades. I didn't know what these were, but he says they're not anti-inflammatory. So I don't know what that means. I think that means they're inflammatory. So no tomatoes, no peppers, no mushrooms, no eggplant. He works out 4 to 5 times a week, but doesn't lift any heavy weights. He says, how strong do I need to be? I only need to be as strong as what it takes to withstand the hits of the season. Trying to lift the maximum weight possible? I don't do those things anymore. You get to a certain age, right? I go to bed very early because I'm up very early. I think that the decisions that I make always center around performance enhancement. So whether that's what I eat or what decisions I make or whether I drink or I don't drink, it's always football centric. I want to be the best that I can be every single day. I want to be the best that I can be every single week. I want to be the best that I can be for my teammates. I love the game, and I want to do it for a long time. I love the game, and I want to do it for a long time. That's the secret to longevity, well, physically. Really thinking about what does it take to put in the discipline to go the distance. And today, as we return to our study in the book of Philippians, Paul shows us his example of what it takes to be resilient and effective in our partnership with one another in doing God's work with perseverance. So if you got your Bibles, you can turn there with me this morning. It's Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. Philippians 1, 12 through 18. Of course, as you know, it's also found in our bulletin. You can just find it right there. And we print it there every Sunday morning so you can follow along. So again, here's Paul writing to the church at Philippi. And he says this: "Now I want you to know, brethren, that my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel, so that my imprisonment in the cause of Christ has become well known throughout the whole Praetorian Guard and to everyone else, and that most of the brethren, trusting in the Lord because of my imprisonment, have far more courage to speak the word of God without fear. Some, to be sure, are preaching Christ even from envy and strife, but some also from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am appointed for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, rather than from pure motives, thinking to cause me distress in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed. And in this I rejoice, yes, and I will rejoice." So here we are, right? This is just the second passage in this letter from Paul to this church in the city of Philippi. And we agreed last week that this letter is a reflection of Paul's relationship with these people. It's a warm message from the founder of a congregation to that church that he founded. And these are people who have supported him and prayed for him and loved him. And Paul, he's got a couple of goals for this letter. Really, two goals. One is pretty clear. Throughout the letter, Paul is exhorting the Philippians. He's exhorting the Philippians. This is just teaching them, telling them what's important, what commands that they need to follow through on in their life with Jesus. The second goal, however, that Paul has is example. So you have exhortation and you have example. That Paul often shifts his whole writing style to the personal. He tells his friends what's happening in his life and his ministry. He does this because, right, this is just what friends do when they write one another. We update one another on what's going on. So we can be in each other's prayers, we can be thinking about one another, we can be just up on the news. But Paul also provides these snapshots into his life to show the Philippians, hey, this is how I react to my circumstances. So that they, in turn, can follow his attitude and his example in their own lives. So, exhortation and example. And clearly this passage of ours this morning is an example passage, right? Because Paul, he says, I want you to know about my circumstance. I want you to know what's going on in my life. He wants them to see what's going on so that his example can be instructive to them. Paul communicates 4 dimensions to what is happening in his life. 4 dimensions of what's happening in his life. First, just the plain circumstances. Just the circumstances that Paul is going through. And this is pretty simple. The circumstances that Paul is going through right now is that he's in Roman custody. He's in prison. This is Paul's imprisonment in the cause of Christ that he speaks about in verse 13. And we know that it's Roman custody. The Roman Empire and the military is holding him because Paul mentions the whole Praetorian Guard. See that there? This is the Roman cohort of soldiers tasked with keeping prisoners, and it's not just, the local police. This is the Roman government, right? And so that being the case, Paul is awaiting some pretty serious charges because the charges are sending him before the Roman authorities. And we see later in Philippians chapter 1 that Paul is mentioning that through this particular imprisonment, he seems to think that his life might be in danger. Just kind of, if you look a little bit farther along in our chapter, he seems to be talking about dying being okay with him as a result of the upcoming trial. And we know that to be under the threat of death, you have to be tried by a Roman judge, because local judges, they just didn't have the authority to execute anyone. You see this in Jesus' example, right? In Jesus' example, they have to call out this guy named Pontius Pilate, who's a Roman, in order to preside over Jesus' trial, right? In terms of conditions of Paul's imprisonment, this being Roman, right? A few historical details are important. First, if the Praetorian Guard were overseeing your imprisonment, you were likely chained to one of them most of the time. That's how they guarded you. You were chained to them. Second, you were, as a prisoner, responsible for your own upkeep. Friend, family, some sort of supporter would be responsible for bringing you food, for providing you clothing, all of the things that you would need. And so this was the role that the church at Philippi in particular was playing. They were sending people and money to Paul so that he would survive his captivity. So those are the circumstances. Easy, right? Circumstances of Paul. This first level of news from the apostle to the church at Philippi. Second level, we could call the positive consequences. The positive consequences to these circumstances of Paul being in jail. And yet, it's surprising, right, to think good things come out of being in jail? Paul says, yeah, definitely. This is great. The first is that these Roman guards who were like watching over Paul's imprisonment, Paul says, I'm not just another prisoner in the system. My imprisonment has become well known among all of these guys as being because I'm teaching about Jesus. My imprisonment in the cause of Christ has become well known to the Praetorian Guard and to everyone else. So apparently, there's some inroads being made here, right? Paul's not just sitting there, twiddling his thumbs, sitting on his hands. He is talking to the people that he's chained to. He's sharing with them. He's introducing the news of Jesus to this whole population of people that rotate through being chained with him. Telling us that wherever Paul is, he is thinking of opportunities to share about who Christ is. And this would be especially significant to the Philippians, if you remember. Now, they're receiving this news because they would immediately recognize, hey, isn't that how our church got started 10 years earlier? Remember last week we talked about this? We learned that the church at Philippi got started in part because Paul was in jail again. Paul was in jail a whole bunch in his life, right? He was in jail in Philippi. And the jailer in Philippi, Paul and his companions shared with that jailer. And that jailer then embraced the news of who Jesus was. They became a Christian. And that was a catalyst in the church being founded in the city of Philippi. So that's positive consequence number one. That Paul is taking even this opportunity right now in jail to share about Jesus. Positive consequence number two, it's just verse number 14. That most of the brethren, trusting in the Lord, because of his imprisonment, have far more courage to speak the word of God without fear. Because people are seeing that Paul is chugging along while he's still in jail, like the Energizer Bunny, undeterred by being in prison, not discouraged by being in chains or under the threat of death. They themselves are emboldened. They say, oh, if Paul can trust in God to bring a good outcome from being arrested, well, by golly, we can continue to preach the word of God wherever we are in our context. Trust that God will guide our paths as well to an outcome that is good and that is useful. So two positive outcomes. Both the proclamation of who Christ is to this population of guards and the encouragement of God's people. But then, after Paul tells about these personal circumstances and this positive consequence, he adds a negative consideration. One negative consideration. And we're actually not really clear on how all of this plays out, but Paul describes this negativity by saying in verse 15, that some, to be sure, are preaching Christ even from envy and strife. And then he goes on, and he describes these people in verse 17 as the former who proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition rather than from pure motives, thinking to cause me distress in my imprisonment. And really, this is all the information that we have on these people. That evidently it is a group of people who see Christian ministry, kind of getting up in front of people and explaining the scriptures and sharing about Jesus with people. They see that as kind of a game, a way to advance themselves. Maybe financially building a large congregation to support them so they can buy fancy things, or gaining themselves a name and being a good speaker, being famous. We probably have a few some contemporary examples probably in our minds when we think about that going on, right? But there's some competitive spirit going on here. Paul cites that they preach Christ from envy and selfish ambition. It's the right message, but the wrong motive. The right message, but the wrong motive. And so these people, they actually are glad that Paul's in jail because they get to absorb all the people that he's not talking to. And they have some ill will towards him, seeking to cause Paul some sort of distress while he's in prison. But that's all we have. But it is significant enough that Paul mentions it here. And he does maybe mention here because it leads to his fourth layer of sharing, the very last, which we can call the big conclusion. The big conclusion. Only that in every way, this is in verse 18, only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed. And in this I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice. That's Paul's takeaway. All of this, this is his takeaway from being in jail, from being under the threat of death, from having people have to bring him food and clothing and rely on their support and provide for his needs, while at the same time, actual fellow believers in Jesus are somehow against him and glad that he's in prison. All of that. Paul looks at the big picture, and he comes to this big conclusion. It's all good. It's more than good. Paul is rejoicing because he can see the positive outcomes of the influence that Jesus is making going forward through all of these different circumstances. You have handed Paul what some might describe not as a glass half full, it's not even a quarter full. I mean, you've handed Paul a glass with, it's got a few drops of fluid in the bottom of that glass, and Paul is taking that glass and he says, awesome. That is exactly how much God has intended, and I will rejoice over it. And again, Paul, he wants to infect the Philippians with this example of this is how you carry on in life. This is how to be resilient and persevering in light of difficult situations in life, difficult situations with our surroundings, difficult situations with our impending futures and our losses, and even difficult situations with fellow believers who may not be acting in the way they should be acting towards you. He wants to show them that in the worst of all situations, in jail, under threat, with even Christians devising negative things against him, Paul's looking for, where's God working? He's looking for how Christ is using him. Looking for opportunity and how the people of God might be impacted. One could hardly think of a more depressing situation than being Paul where he is. And he says, in this I rejoice. Yes, I will rejoice. So that we can look at our own circumstances with that kind of resilience that we need, especially us, right? As a new congregation, just being planted here, so we can find some way to say in the struggle of growing a church, and in this I rejoice, yes, I will rejoice. So a couple of applications we can take away from Paul's example of resilience. The first is, of course, be prepared for adversity. Be prepared for adversity. Like it's par for the course. Be prepared for all kinds of sources. Paul launches off here with the most obvious, obviously, that when we are living out the Christian life in our context, with people around us who do not follow Jesus' values, who don't want to hear about forgiveness, who do not want to hear about God's love, or even the existence of God. They just don't want to hear it. We can expect persecution, negative responses. For Paul, even jail and the threat of death. Paul provides his own example so that the Philippians, they come to grips with the fact that, yeah, this is life. This is just how life is. This is within the realm of expectation of how things go. And then Paul just comes out and he actually confirms this dynamic when he writes to his protege Timothy later on in 2 Timothy 3:12. And he says, indeed, all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. That's the expectation. But then Paul also includes the fact that when we are living the Christian life, seeking to do God's will, just walking along, that does not exempt us from problems from fellow believers. This is our blind spot. This is precisely why he also mentions not only his imprisonment, but the fact that there are preachers, real Christian leaders in the church, who were acting out of wrong motives. To let the Philippians know, hey, this happens too. It happens too. Not all believers are perfect. The church is not perfect. Even those deemed to mature in the faith aren't free from every immature impulse in their lives. And if we're going to persevere in our love for God's people and in service to his community, we need to have kind of an accurate picture. Resilience means having a realistic picture of what it means to walk alongside one another together in this life with Christ. We're seated close enough for this, although we're kind of seated a little bit farther apart. This was the very first exercise that they did with us when I went off to college. And you don't go straight to college, right? You go to college orientation first. So we went to orientation the summer before. We were all freshmen, all seated in this large lecture hall. We were barely not high school students, right? You just right out of high school and going to orientation. This was the summer before, and we were supposed to be being welcomed to campus. Fun events, club presentations, introduction to dormitory life, that kind of business. But instead, we were ushered into this large auditorium. Pretty much all of us strangers, 500 or more of us, because it was a really big auditorium. This is just a fraction of the freshman class. And we're all frightened of the academic load that's coming up, right? We're all frightened that we would not make friends. We're all frightened, we might starve if we do not know how the cafeteria line works. And the speaker, he takes the stage. First thing that he says to us is this. He says, freshmen, look to the person on your left, like you have someone to your left. Look to the person on your right, like you might have someone to your right. He says, look at those two people. Of the three of you, statistically, only one of you will graduate from this institution after 4 years. Only one of you. The rest of you are going to run out of money. You're not going to be able to deal with life without your parents looking after you. You will not be able to handle the academic load, or you'll drop out for one dramatic reason or another. Which one of you will be the one with the resilience and perseverance to be that graduate? It scared us to death. Suddenly our time of, hey, let's make friends and have barbecues and be introduced to our resident assistants and join clubs, just got real. College put into context, into the real context that there were going to be difficulties, there were going to be time crunches, there's going to be juggling schedules and prioritizing relationships and activities, and there's going to be money woes. We had a 33% chance of making it through this gauntlet that he's laid before us called college. It was going to present difficulty. And this is why Paul is sharing his circumstances, so that the Philippians and we have a realistic view on our own faith journey with Christ together. That we too should be prepared for adversity. First application. Second, just as easy. And that is have perspective on hardship. Have perspective, have Paul's perspective on hardship. Really, that's what it is. Be like Paul. Stare at the difficulties and understand there's a bigger plan here. There is a bigger plan. There's a bigger purpose. Since God is in control, since God sees the past and the present and the future, and since God is moving all of history and our particular lives intentionally together, that whatever we're in, it fits into that plan. And God is wise, and God is powerful. Paul searched his circumstances, saw all the ways that God was in the circumstances. Him being in jail meant that others became bolder with telling people about Jesus. Him being in jail brought the message of Jesus to a previously unreached group of people, right? When would Roman soldiers ever have the opportunity to hear about Christ? Even him being in jail stoked people who had poor motives to teach about Jesus with more vigor, even though they were poorly motivated. God was using all of the negatives to a net positive. And we're not always going to see the net positives. We are not always going to see the net positives. But they're there. They are there. This is what the book of Job is all about. You remember Job, right? It's like the oldest book of the Bible. Job, he's surrounded only by great circumstances. He's got everything going on. He's got a great life. He's got a great wife. He's got much wealth, he's got much health, happiness all around him. And then Satan comes to God. And he tells God, of course Job loves you. Of course he's really all for you and praising you. Because all you do is bless him. Take away the blessings. Give Job adverse circumstances, and he's going to curse you to your face. He's not going to trust in you at all. And so God allows Satan to take all the blessings away. And right, we see he really takes everything away. The family is killed. The wife leaves him. The wealth is gone. And even Job's health is even taken away. We see him, he's sitting in this ash heap, and he's scraping these boils on his flesh with these potsherds, right? And he doesn't even have the comfort of friends. All his friends do is they come and they surround him and tell him, hey, you're the cause of all of this happening to you. Wonderful friends, aren't they? And in the end, there is a reversal, right? Everything comes back. But the kicker is this. God never explains to Job why. God never explains to Job why. He doesn't pull back the cosmic curtain and tell Job, hey, there was this discussion that I had seen, and you were there. No. That Job, in some way, would be eternity's narrative of suffering and faithfulness. He's not privy to the fact that Job's story would serve for the next thousands of years to be the instruction manual on God's sovereign will and our faith in the midst of suffering. No, he doesn't. He gets none of that. So we may never know for certain every single reason for the difficulties we experience in persecution, in disagreements in the church, in whatever hurdles in life come. Like Paul, we might be an example to bolster the faith of other people. We might have some unforeseen consequences. Strange, it might encourage some other ill-motivated person to be, right? More vigorous in whatever they do in the faith. And we might be made weak so someone else can serve us and increase their compassion or their abilities. There's so many consequences, seen, unseen, unforeseen, from every single difficulty. This is the faith that we're asked to have. We have to realize that we're not supposed to have a pain-free life away from difficulty or injustice or suffering. But so much of faith is in trials. And our response to those trials, knowing that God is working and He's there. Many years ago, I participated in a mission trip to Hong Kong. This is many, many years ago. This is back when Hong Kong was, I think they call it in the Commonwealth, right? Yeah. The British rule that's pre-China handoff, right? And so this was really a vital time in the life of Hong Kong. We didn't know if China was going to come and crack down on Christians and outlaw all faith. And it looks like that's happening, but just is taking a longer time, right? So we had a big team. We had probably 60 or 70 people go over, and we hopped off of our plane, and we separated into teams to different parts of Hong Kong. And we were introduced to our guides. We had guides. These were people that churches kind of volunteered up to help us navigate. They helped us plan ministries there, service translators in Hong Kong. Basically, they were our partners and serving and ministering we were there for 2 months, really a long time. And our team guides, still remember, when you are serving in a ministry and you get to serve people of a different language, you have the opportunity to choose your own name. So they chose their own names. The first guy, he named himself, because he had long hair and I think he had a rather inflated view about himself, he named himself Samson. Yeah. So we said, oh, you're Samson. He's like, I am now. The other guy, very neat, soft-spoken, kind of like the strong but silent type, took much less of a flamboyant name. You have your choice of name. He said, I'm Eric. Sure, okay. Whatever, right? And we spent weeks with these two. Incredibly helpful. They went everywhere with us. They taught English with us. They helped us share about Jesus. Even without any language skills, we just pointed things. And they prepared churches so that we could serve there and lived with us. They served with us and served us. And so and we all assumed that these were like servants in their chat, that they had been, rather mature. And we started talking about their backgrounds. And Samson, he had grown up in church and served in church. He was a leader with his youth ministry. But Eric, we asked, So where do you serve in church? And because he always seemed very mature and helpful and just there, knowledgeable about the scriptures. And he said, oh, this is the first time that I've really served in any kind of formal capacity. Actually, I haven't been a follower of Christ for very long. Totally amazed us. Because we had always seen Eric as a resource, as the mature, knowledgeable guy that would, hold us by the hand here. But Samson, he chimed in, and he told us later, Eric, he's where he is now. He's matured so quickly in his faith. He's only been a Christian for 2 years. But once he received Christ into his life, Eric's family was Buddhist. Once he received Christ into his life, they immediately not only disowned him, they cut off all support, they kicked him out of the household, and they would have nothing to do with him. He had not spoken to anyone in his family for 2 years because they would not communicate with him at all. And so Eric fell in the mercy of his fellow believers. He stayed with them. He learned from them. He served them and served with them. And it was a terrible hardship, which had made Eric this spiritual giant who was humble and gentle and mature. But it was a byproduct of pain. It was a byproduct of difficulty, this maturity. And we need to see this, that life is intertwined and full of unforeseen consequences that we do not expect. And Paul's point is that we need to stick with it. Keep on sharing the news of who Jesus is. Keep on loving the people of God. Keep on encouraging others, because God has this grand plan rooted in what we thought was the worst tragedy in all of history. That tragedy, that the Son of God would die. We would betray him, we would torture him, that we would execute him on a cross. But through that greatest tragedy was also God's greatest triumph. We were loved. God was glorified. All of history came together. And so when we do not see the purpose of our difficulties, imprisonment or sickness or discouragement, difficulty being disowned, being quarantined perhaps, whatever it might be, look to Paul's imprisonment. But see the cross. See the cross. And know that God works amazing and unexpected consequences. And that he is at work in our lives right now. Knowing this brings a surprising resilience to our lives. And our commitment to God's people, an ability to persevere with the people of God, with our circumstances, with all of life. We're able to do that when God brings things to our doorstep.